Well, good morning, y'all. June 1st. Half the year is almost over. Here we are, 2026. Hope everyone had a great weekend. Beautiful weather here in Flagstaff. Out on my motorcycle for a good ride. But we're back to work for the week. Anyway, we're looking at Genesis 3. It's a pivotal point in biblical history and prophetic history. I want to reiterate some things. Traditional theology, for the most part, says that possibly or probably Adam and Eve ate an apple from an actual literal tree. I've read some accounts where they say it was a pear or a plum or some actual physical fruit. And as I've stated, if you go through the entire book of Genesis all the way down to the book of Revelation, if you look at the dietary laws that God gave Israel through Moses, you will not find where God forbid or suggested or even implied subtly to not eat any kind of physical fruit, because that's what took place in the garden that caused death. You're not going to find it. To suggest that Adam and Eve ate an apple, and I've seen photographs, pictures of an actual tree with an actual snake wrapped around the trunk or the branch, with showing Adam and Eve plucking an actual apple from the tree. If you're going to believe that, then you might as well believe evolution and do away with Genesis 1 and 2. If you're going to accept the theological tradition of an actual apple that caused death, then you might as well pray to Mary in hopes you can get her to take your prayers to Yeshua. That's about how much sense it makes. But we're looking at a convergence in Genesis 3. And since all scripture is given by inspiration of God, then God, Yahweh, wants us to look at all scripture and see how that inspiration ties into a particular topic, subject, occurrence. And one of the main reasons, one of the main reasons Yeshua spoke in parables was to give a mental picture of a spiritual revelation. Let me repeat that. To give a mental picture of a spiritual revelation. It's like when he said, except you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you have no life in you. Now, people that knew the law knew that that it was forbidden to eat human flesh and drink human blood. And yet he's using a parable, a metaphor, a mental picture to bring forth a spiritual revelation. And if the crowd that walked away, if they would have just hung around for a few more minutes, he clearly explained what that was. But as the theme of Yahweh's message to us, the theme of his voice versus other voices, the crowd that walked away could not hear the voice of Yahweh speaking through Yeshua. They said, this is a hard saying. Your voice, the words of your voice is hard. It's hard to accept. It's hard to grasp. It's hard to comprehend. Yes, I agree. Many times you read scriptures and prophecies and you think, wow, that's tough. It's just like when Yeshua said, he's talking about a funeral and burying the dead. He said, let the dead bury the dead. Pick up your cross and follow me. It's a hard saying. When he went in and cleansed the temple and told them they were a bunch of thieves and robbers, his voice, his words went against theological tradition of that day, and they were greatly offended. So even though the voice of God can give much comfort, peace, joy, contentment. You know, if you read the 23rd Psalm, the voice of God, it gives much peace and comfort. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me to lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside the still waters. He restores my soul. Comfort, peace, joy, harmony. The voice of God can do that. But then the voice of God can turn around and say, as he did to the Pharisees, you're of your father, the devil. For he was a murderer from the beginning, and there's no truth in him. In other words, there's no truth in you. All of your religious pomp, all of your self-righteous external religious practices, it's of the devil. Because you appear righteous, but inside you're full of dead men's bones. You're hypocrites. That's what hypocrisy is. It's attempting to display moral virtue or righteousness, but the wolf in sheep's clothing has a different intent. Yes, they appeared righteous to the public, but Yeshua saw down to the depths of their heart. He always looked at the heart and said, you're of your father, the devil. Your motive, your intent is self-righteousness. You're not moral at all. You're like whited sepulchres, painted sepulchres that look beautiful on the outside, but inside it's still full of death. So, this convergence of scriptures that we're looking at takes us all the way back to Genesis 3. What did Yeshua mean when he said to the Pharisees, you're of your father the devil, for he was a murderer and he was a liar from the beginning, from Genesis? There were times when he would make reference to that. It has been said thus and so, but from the beginning it was not so. So Genesis is the foundational revelation by which everything down through biblical history and biblical prophecy springs forward. And as I said, if the act of death, the act of disobedience by Adam and Eve that caused death was eating an apple, well, surely we would be reminded of that all down through Scripture, but we're not. But here are things we are reminded of. As we just said, Jesus referred back to the beginning, the devil, a murderer and liar from the beginning. Jesus talked about adultery, both a physical act and a spiritual act, both a physical performance and a spiritual revelation. All down through the Bible, we see this theme of adultery, fornication, adultery, immorality. Clear up into the book of Revelation, where the voice of God calls a religious system a harlot, a whore with harlot daughters. Something to contemplate, isn't it? The scripture we referred to in the previous video on lust, it had to have a beginning. It had to have a genesis somewhere. God's voice tells us when a man falls into the snare of temptation, he's drawn away by his own lust, his own fleshly lust, fleshly desires, has nothing to do with God whatsoever. And when lust is conceived, it brings forth sin. And when sin is finished, it brings forth death. So where is the first mention of death, sin, lust? Genesis 3. Sin is the transgression of the law. God's law in Genesis was, do not touch the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Don't touch it. Don't eat of it. You die if you do so. That's his law. So sin is the transgression of the law. And the voice of God tells us when lust is conceived, it brings forth sin. So lust violates God's law. Lust causes man to violate God's law because it's sin. It's a transgression of the law. I want you to contemplate that, pray about that, look at that, look at the scripture. When lust is conceived, it brings forth sin, and sin is the transgression of the law. And the scripture tells us that both Adam and Eve were in the transgression. Both sinned. But the woman sinned by deception. Adam was not deceived. He willfully partook of the sin, which was a type of Christ later on. And when sin is finished, when the transgression is finished, it brings forth death. Isn't that what happened in Genesis 3? In the day that you eat thereof, you will surely die. And every human being that came forth after Genesis 3, or from Genesis 3, never reached 1,000 years, because 1,000 years is one day with the Lord. Methuselah lived the longest, 969 years, but he fell short. God didn't say you would die immediately. He said in the day. In that 1,000-year day, you'll die. And they did. The genealogy is full of offspring being born and death, offspring and death, offspring and death. And this one lived so many years and died. And this one lived so many years and died. So lust was aroused and awakened in Genesis 3. Now Yahweh had told them, I want you to be fruitful and multiply and replenish the earth. How is that to happen? Well, once again, we have to look at the scripture. The scriptures speak for themselves. It doesn't need theological interpretation. It doesn't need man trying to figure God out and then setting it in stone as a doctrine, theological doctrine. This is what our denomination believes. That doesn't impress God. God reveals his truth to every generation, and it started in Genesis. So he said, be fruitful and multiply and replenish the earth. And he had a specific way he wanted to do that. And what was that way? Well, he proved what way it was by the birth of Yeshua. Yeshua took a virgin womb and by his Spirit spoke Yeshua into that womb. No lust, no sexual urge, no sexual act. Yeshua came by the spoken word. That God's voice spoke through Gabriel. That is how Yahweh wanted children to come forth in Genesis, by the spoken word. You say, well, how can you prove that? Because everything that God created, from the time he said, let there be light, clear up to creating mankind, humankind, the man and the woman, it came by his spoken word. And his spoken word concluded with, and it was good. Stop and think about that. Don't get excited, just think about it. It all came by his spoken word until Genesis 3, and then that spoken word was ignored and something else was introduced. Lust of the flesh was introduced. A sexual act by lust was introduced. You say, oh, that's impossible. That's heresy. That's ridiculous. Really? Okay, I want all of you men to look in the mirror, be honest with yourself, and ask yourself, what is the most forceful drive that you have in your human body? Is it hunger? Is it thirst? Is it sleep? Is it to be successful? I'm not saying those aren't forces in us, but what's the strongest force that drives a man? Think about it. Lust for the opposite sex. Lust for the opposite sex. God's revelation resides in our own body every day. It speaks to us every day. I don't care how loyal you are to your wife, and that's certainly what we should be. But that's why Yeshua said, if a man looks upon a woman to lust after her in his heart, he's already committed adultery. So I don't care how loyal we are. You let an attractive woman go by. Let a woman walk by with an erotic scent, perfume, whatever, dressed a certain way, walking a certain way, looking a certain way. And it's instantaneous. The flesh, the lust of the flesh wants to raise up. And many times it does. That's why we have adultery, fornication, and other sexual perversions that's even beyond adultery and fornication. But it had to have its genesis. Something had to look upon the woman in Genesis 3 and lust after her and arouse that lust in her, because prior to that they were innocent. Adam and Eve were innocent. They were naked and unashamed. They were innocent. But something awakened lust. And we'll pick that up in the next video. I hope I've said enough to get you thinking, probably, maybe even to make you angry and call me a heretic. I don't know. That's okay. We're just going to let the scriptures speak for itself. We're just going to let the voice of God speak for himself. Till next time, remain in the peace and love of Yeshua.